Hello, Abby and Kim.
Hello. Can you hear us?
We can. Matilda and I have a question for you to kickstart your time in the Department for Dreams this afternoon. We wonder, can you tell us what is for dinner in the food revolution, and also what's for pudding?
Good question.
Abby, do you want to go first?
What's for dinner? Maybe I'll do dinner. Well, I think dinner. Are we getting feedback? Is that my fault? So dinner in the food revolution is all about a plate that reflects the farm. So there are certain things happening on more ecological farms and more regenerative farms. For example, doing things, farmers will do like a crop rotation, for example. So they're growing many different many different crops in the same field over a number of years. And they have to do that in order for the soil to regain its life in a way and to build up nutrition over many years. And so people like Kim and others are starting to create meals that include the many different parts of that system that's required in order to build up the soil health. So that can include things like, for example, pasture-fed pork. The animals are grazing on clover some of the years, and it can include different pulses and beans, because they're putting nitrogen back into the soil. And then one of the years, it might also include a wheat, a diverse population wheat, which we'll hear more about in a second. So I think that's what's for dinner. What's for dessert?
Okay, I'll do dessert. I think for me, it doesn't, I mean, whatever the course, the important thing is that every ingredient that goes into the food that I eat, I want to know where it comes from. And that's the starting point for me in terms of reinventing or reimagining a better food system for the future, is just to really interrogate the decisions that you're making by informing yourself. And that was the starting point for me of starting a small food producing business, was basically, if I just interrogate the ingredients back to the soil, back to the crop rotation, back to the farming system, back to the people who are involved, what might I find and how might that influence my decision-making in building a new system? So I would like to think that, you know, my dinner and my pudding in all instances is always made at every level, back down to the breeding of seeds, ideally, by people I know. I think that's important.
We'll have that. Thank you very much.
And to enjoy the afternoon.
Yeah.
Thank you, Barry.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us here.
Hey, Abby, this feels very strange.
I know.
I feel like we're a little bit at sea. But yeah, exciting.
Maybe we should start saying a little bit about what we do, and then I'll jump into some questions.
Okay. Yeah, I'll maybe start. I'm sat in the place where I work. It's a small bakery in an urban location in the city of Nottingham, and I started this bakery 6 years ago, really as an experiment to see if I could invent a way to run a small food producing business without entering into the large scale commodified global industry that I'd kind of come to detest. So the question I asked myself was, if I don't like the prevailing food system and I think it can be done better, what would my version look like as an alternative? So I've been running a bakery for 6 years now, and I've managed to drag a few people along for the ride. We're a team of 7, and we operate in the space that you can see behind me, making everything from bread to jam to meals to all kinds of preserves, and really just trying to interrogate our own local food system, but then expanding that out into work that's going on in a national and international arena, I suppose.
Cool. Well, I'll say I have a lot of questions. I think you knew it when I was talking, because otherwise I get lazy.
Sorry. Okay.
It's okay. Cool. Okay, so I'm Abby Rose, and I basically spent everything in my life is about building ecology, profitability, and beauty on farms around the world. And the reason I became totally committed to farming, which is not something I've always been involved in, was that when I was about 20 years old, my parents started farming, and I spent some time on the farm, and I started to really realize that farms are basically the main interaction point that we as humans have with the natural world, or as a civilization we have with the natural world, and that the decisions that farmers make on a day-to-day basis really affect us all. And I just feel like most people don't realize that, or I don't know, for some reason I had never understood that at all, and I just hadn't realized how important farming is for everyone. And so once that insight started to dawn on me, I just realized I wanted everything I did to be about sharing that message with people, and encouraging more people to be involved in farming so that we can all be engaged with what the system is about and how we're interacting with the natural world. And so as part of that, I make apps, an app called Soil Mentor that helps farmers monitor their own soil. And then I also make a podcast called Farmerama Radio. And that's sharing the voices of the regenerative farming movement. And that's really how I met Kim, was through some of the Farmerama Radio recording outings. And I wanted to ask Kim to share a little bit about when we first met, because it was quite a peculiar situation, or odd. And yeah, I'd love to share if you remember a bit more about that, Kim.
Yeah, when I met you, it was a very transformative time in my life for both in that moment, but also in the wider context of how I came to be there. I was at a farming conference, basically trying to represent, as a baker, the interests of a seed breeder who was putting forward the idea that we need genetically diverse seeds in order to farm in a way that's low input and sustainable. So I guess that was our meeting point in terms of where our interests collided. I wanted to make a bread that was sustainable, and I just ended up interrogating that decision, or interrogating that idea right down to the genetics of the seed. That's a very long story, but essentially we came to be standing in a field. It was sweltering hot. I was very out of place. I was sort of urban, sort of city girl, gone to a farming conference, and I remember standing there with no insect repellent and no shade, and burning and sweating, and I had bread and butter, and the butter was dribbling off the table. But it was really interesting because I was standing able to give out my bread right next to a wheat trial crop, and I had this sort of conveyor of people going past, looking at the wheat and tasting the bread. And to me, that didn't seem very strange, but it quickly became apparent at that event that it was a bit strange, and it didn't really happen. So, a couple of things that came about during that day was that I met you. And I also found it strange that someone wanted to interview me about the bread that I made. That was, I know that kind of opened up a whole load of possibilities. But also the thing that stays in my mind, and I know stays in yours, is that we met a farmer that day called Mark Lee. And how this came about is I was just standing giving out bread in this field to people who were interested in the crop. And most people were just having a taste and then wandering on, saying thank you. Mark kept taking slice after slice, and I couldn't really get my head around this because I hadn't done a very good job of baking that day. It was fine. But later he introduced himself to me, and he explained that he was a farmer who'd been growing this experimental wheat crop for 7 years. And at that moment, standing in that field with me was the first time he'd ever eaten that crop. That was a huge kind of penny drop moment for me in my journey. mainly because I had always thought that my job as a kind of food retailer and producer was to do things better, but also to try and take people along for the ride. And I thought the people I needed to focus on were actually the customers. And I realized that day that we had to really look back as bakers and as grocers and retailers at the farming community and make sure that we closed the entire circle. So we also had work to do. We weren't just about reconnecting people with agricultural activity, but we actually needed to reconnect people who worked in agriculture with the food landscape in urban environments. So
maybe could you say a little more also, Kim, about, you know, coming in as a baker or, you know, with the small food bakery experiment, and then like what, yeah, could you maybe explain a little more about the food system in its current state and what you kind of see are some of the biggest barriers or issues that we face?
For me, the biggest issue are the barriers. So the food system has gotten so big that I think us as individuals find it very difficult to see our place within it. We've kind of handed over the power and also the responsibility for the production of our food to almost imaginary others. Those others are actually big corporations. And I don't think we quite realize how narrow and controlled and unfair our food system is. It's designed to give us a perception of choice, but actually there isn't really much choice. And there's a lot that's wrong with it and a lot that's unfair. In the UK, we purchase 97% of all of our grocery, food grocery from supermarkets. And 70% of those purchases are from just 4 companies that all operate in virtually the same business model and present themselves in a very similar way. The whole system is very manipulative, and I don't think, I suppose what I would like to do is to shine a light on how unfair it is, how damaging to the environment it is, and how it isn't very delicious, I suppose, at the end of the day. And the thing I wanted to do is just present an alternative to that. So an alternative system that sits completely outside of that. And so my ambition, hence saying, I've been trying to build a food system that does not engage with the commodity markets at all. It does not commodify people or ingredients or the land or seeds in any way. And hopefully my ultimate aim is to make something a bit more delicious. Yeah, over to you. I'm not sure.
No, yeah. And I think the other thing that's so interesting about our current food system as well is we have this really strong narrative, certainly in the UK, that we need industrial food and industrial farming to feed the world. And I like, that's to me one of the strongest myths that we all live by. I think there's some key points around that most people don't realize, which is that firstly, 70% of all food actually comes from small-scale farms. And I think that that's an amazing fact. And actually, once you start to like uncover this idea of commodities and knowing that farmers are so removed from the idea of what they're creating is actually food, it starts to make a lot of sense, that fact, because actually over 50% of the wheat grown in the UK last year went to feed animals. So it didn't actually go to feed human beings, it went to feed animals. And then a large proportion of the crops grown in the world actually go into biofuel. So actually a lot of what's grown is grown at industrial scales, is grown to feed energy or power plants and to feed animals. So I think that one of the big pieces that we have to do is to encourage people to realize that we don't need to buy into those overarching myths or stories that we're told again and again, basically by the industrial system. You know, it's kind of trapping us into believing their story. And so I think that that's quite empowering to move out of that. I wanted to ask you also a little bit about Yeah, so maybe you could also tell us a little bit about how you see that, you know, small food as an experiment. How is it more of, could you give us an example of 2 or 3 things that show why you're more of a regenerative food production, food retail system? What does that look like in real life or on the ground?
I guess it occurs to me to perhaps talk about something overarching first, which is about value systems, because what you just said about how we buy into this myth just brought me back to kind of what I see as the root of commodification, which is money. And money is really a kind of extrinsic value that we all buy into. And we're kind of told that it's efficient to farm in this way, or it's efficient to make food in this way. And I guess one of the things I hope to uncover, and I feel like we do, is to shatter that myth as well. And I think it's very difficult to break the idea of one of the most fundamental extrinsic values that we all share as humans, which is that money is really important and it's currency, and kind of move away to the idea that actually food is probably one of the most powerful currencies. And obviously that, you know, one of the biggest problems with our current prevailing system and the supermarket system is that there are a lot of people who are excluded from that food system because they don't have access to money. And we probably place far too much importance on money in society. So I guess for me, one of the aspects that I'm most excited about within our bakery, and I am proud of, is the fact that we actually barter for ingredients. And I'm from Nottingham, where we don't have a huge horticultural tradition. It's very hard to buy fruit and vegetables that are grown locally to the city commercially. So one of the things that we decided to do in order to get those ingredients into the bakery without entering the commodity system was actually to ask our customers or the people around us whether they'd like to bring us things from their gardens and allotments and barter. So we run a barter book, which I think probably breaches a few tax laws, but I'm totally cool with that, and I'm prepared to take on any potential legal challenges that may come. But I'm very proud to say that last year we bartered over £2,500 worth of fresh fruit and vegetables, and it also brings costs. So it serves 2 purposes. One is it brings in crops and ingredients to us that are grown in the very best way with the most care, and people don't purposefully set out to degenerate their own gardens and allotments through their growing practice because they don't see any monetary value in it. But actually they're very proud to bring us the stuff and then see it kind of presented back to them as products to share with other people. And also the kind of positive flip side has been that we've gained an audience for our baking that perhaps wouldn't have come in because they maybe saw our products as being a little too highly priced, but doing it on a barter works for us. So I just think that's a really interesting example of an economic mechanism that we've uncovered that's kind of causing this question. I probably don't have enough time to tell you anymore.
Yeah, and I think that's so interesting because that is one of the things that we've really understood. I guess we didn't really define regenerative farming, but essentially regenerative farming is the idea when farmers farm with soil health and biodiversity front and center in their minds. And they're looking around and observing the natural systems and working with them as opposed to trying to control them or kill them, essentially, which is the other model of farming. And so, you know, I became a massive proponent of regenerative farming, and I still am, obviously, and that's how we farm on my family's farm. And it's a journey, and you're constantly learning and experimenting. And I think what we started to see and what we've started to realize is that actually the economic structures have to be part of this regenerative transition or new paradigm. Because as you're finding with the bakery, like if you're not creating these new models of exchange, you get caught up, you somehow get sucked back in to the more extractive mindset, essentially. And so I wanted to share a little bit about some of the inspiration I've had in terms of thinking about what regenerative economy might mean versus an extractive economy. And I was going to share, let me just share let's have a look. So I wanted to just share the work of, this is the work of a lady called Jennifer Armbrust in LA. And she's come up with something called the feminine economy. I didn't actually want to share that one just yet. 1 second here, sorry. Let's try this one. Oh, it's the same one. Oh, well, okay, fine. Okay, so she, has come up with something called the feminine business principles, and also, oh, here we go, sorry. And also the feminine economy. And what she essentially says is, if we've been living in what she calls the masculine economy, and what I've started to call the more extractive economy, the values that we like celebrate are things like individualism, competition, hierarchy, ownership, materialism, dominion over people and nature, profit worship, vilification of poverty, and then also buying into the myth of meritocracy. And we've been valuing all those things, and the people who do the best in those are the ones who kind of do the best in that extractive economy. And then she presents, what are the values for what she calls the feminine economy, and what I'm increasingly starting to call the more regenerative economy, which are the values of gratitude, integrity, honesty, connecting with nature, empathy, ease, collaboration, cyclical growth, generosity. And I think what's so interesting is that if you imagine a business and a farming business that's built on gratitude, integrity, resourcefulness, cyclical growth, it changes the game completely, essentially. And it allows for this whole new way of operating in the world. And I think what you're doing, Kim, is that you are coming from a place of how can we create a regenerative economy that's centered around those values. And that, is completely different. And I think she also has the feminine business principles, which is the other slide I was going to try and share with you, but let's have a go here. Okay, here they are. And I think these are really also have certainly been a huge guide for me on operating in the business world. The principles for prototyping a feminist business. Just the idea, this number 11, a business can be a healing for yourself and others. I think that's such a radical idea, but why is it a radical idea? And it seems to me that, of course, business should be a healing for yourself and others. And even you have a body, again, it's such a simple statement, but for some reason in the business world, it seems so out of place. So I've been using these principles to really guide what a regenerative economy and a regenerative way of being might look like. So it'd be great to hear from you, Kim, what do from your perspective, what does the feminine economy look like in the food and farming system?
Well, there's a couple of things one of the things I love about that diagram is actually most of those ideas or those values on the end of those spikes are intrinsic values. They're beliefs that we hold as individuals. And there are also things that I learned from spending time on really holistically thought through regenerative farms. And I think there are a group of farmers in the UK and also in the world who think really deeply about these things and actually find themselves accidentally in an extractive economy when really their work is far more valuable than that. I've learned a lot from farms in terms of things I might like to bring into the bakery. But I think the thing I'd like to just flag up most of all is number one, you have a body. And I think for people who work in food service, this is essential because what I see in food production and food service and hospitality is that people are commodified and they're just not really respected. And there's a lot of mental health problems in that sector. And I feel like it's not a job that's really valued anymore in society. So one of the things I really, really hope that we can all collectively achieve over the next few years is to put back at the heart of the community the people who can make food for us, the people who can grow food for us, and then those experts who are able to bring that food from wherever it's made or grown and bring it into our communities through shops. And I just think the supermarkets have really downvalued all of the people who work in those roles. So yeah, I'd just like to, in our new social and economic order, I'd really like to see those people valued again. I know that we're coming towards the end of our time, so I thought maybe we could just touch upon the future. And Abby, I wanted to ask you to maybe talk about something that you're hopeful for in the coming months or years. And we've worked on a lot of projects together, and there's some exciting stuff coming. But I feel like you and I have met through a kind of shared interest in these intrinsic values and how they can be applied to actually make much bigger change. So I think it's probably interesting to conclude by talking about some of the ways in which we feel we can influence or spread our kind of ideas and work in the coming year or two, maybe.
Yes. So I think one interesting thing. So I work together with Kim and a number of other people in the world of wheat and cereals to create a 6-part series called Cereal. And it really, it started with the health and how eating bread relates to human bodies. And then it kind of looks at bread through the many different lenses. So like through the breeding of seeds, through the farming of it, through the milling, through the baking, and then the future. And and it's all about tracing like why we've got into the situation we have today, and also this new grains movement, which Kim is very much a big part of, that's really happening in the UK today. And what does that look like? And what does this regenerative system look like? And it is quite complex, but the story tells it in I think a relatively simple way. So definitely encourage people to tune in to Cereal. It's on the Farmerama radio feed. But one of the things that really gives me hope for the future and was the response from the farming community to that series. Because a big focus of the series in the end was Katie, who hosted it. She uncovered that really joy is a big part of a regenerative food system. And that that's something that's really kind of been knocked out of us, as we've discussed. And we've kind of been sold this story that you can't have any joy if we want to have everyone fed, for example. And I think the series kind of shows it's almost exactly the opposite. That joy is the path to feeding everyone, and to feed and nourishing everyone. And so it was really interesting to see some very conventional chemical-based farmers get in touch and say oh my gosh, that series, it brought me to tears. I was reconnected with my wheat. For the first time ever, I went out and ground some wheat and made bread with my own wheat. It just never had even occurred to me. And I think that I was completely shocked. I was really scared that we were going to have quite a negative reaction from the farming community. So yeah, that really filled me with a lot of hope. And I feel like storytelling and sticking to these kind of core values of what it means to be a human being is actually a way to move forward in the food and farming system together, and across, many different people from many different perspectives can come together around some core human values. I saw Emmy asked if we could just say a little more about what does it mean to be on a regenerative farm, what might it look like? Regenerative farming looks like you walk onto the farm, and I guess diversity is the key. So there's all different colored flowers in amongst the crops. There's trees everywhere. There's an abundance of water. Even if it's dry, there's still going to be water around in different places on the farm. And it's also generally a system. The farm is a system. So it may be that this field right now it has, or on my family's farm, for example, we have sheep grazing between our trees. We have almonds, olives. and different pistachios. And then we're moving the sheep around because they're the way that we add a lot of the, we build the fertility of the soil and retain water in the soils. I think one of the funny things about regenerative farms is they look pretty like wild. There's lots of different things going on. It's not a preened environment. And I think that for me, I've really learned to love that beauty. But it is a new way of looking at beauty that's not like, if you see a perfectly plowed field or perfectly planted field with all of the weeds in between killed, that's not what it's like, because in a way, in a regenerative farming, certain weeds can be a benefit. Okay, sorry, let me just get to the first question. Do you think there'll be more or less small farmers 5 years from now, and why? And how can more people be encouraged to consider becoming farmers? What do you think, Kim?
I know we need to wrap up shortly, so I'm gonna maybe try and answer that question. And also we've had a question, how do we see connection with community support farms and bakeries, and how much potential is there for a model towards a localized economy? And I think both can be answered by really explaining the crux of regeneration, which is about thinking about design as a cycle and as a circle. And someone also asked, what's it like if they come to your business, whether it's a farm or a bakery? And I think for me, going on a regenerative farm, you really feel it's very beautiful, and it gives you an appetite. I think you should be able to walk onto a farm and you should feel an appetite for the crops that are growing, for the animals that are being reared, and you should feel like you know your place within it. And that's what I hope to create in the bakery as well. I think hopefully when people come here, they receive kind service, and they receive information and they feel included. And what we experience as bakers working in this environment is that they generally then give back to us. I think there's so much potential for more community collaboration between farms and bakeries. That's what needs to happen. And if that happens, then there's potential for local and regional grain economies to flourish. But the thing to hold on to, I think, and the thing I'd like to conclude with, is that we have to all remember to get involved with each other and to be our own food system. This is about creating feedback loops and creating community around food. And if we do that, it's amazing what you can achieve, even in a very, very short space of time. I don't know if you have any final thoughts, Abby, and then I guess we maybe hand over to the others.
I guess my final thought is just that ultimately all of this is about empowering people and bringing agency back, whether it's to the farm, whether it's the person eating the food, whether it's the baker. I think, in one of the earlier talks today, they really focused on that finding oneself and really having self-confidence. And I think that's also a lot of what is at the core of all of our work as well, is it's about allowing people to feel empowered in their own decision-making and connecting with their community and really having the power lie there. So that was my final thought.